Hermann Göring, one of the key figures in Nazi Germany, was not only Reich's marshal and Hitler's successor, but also one of the most prolific art collectors of his time. His passion for collecting was as great as his political ambitions. At the height of his power, Göring assembled a huge collection of more than 4,200 items, including paintings, sculptures, furniture, tapestries, and coins. Paintings occupied a special place in the collection, with over 1,300 canvases, including masterpieces by old masters. However, behind the facade of an art lover lay a cynical and ruthless looter. A significant part of his collection was assembled through looting and confiscations in the occupied territories of Europe. Jewish families and museums, whose valuables were forcibly seized, fell victim to this systematic robbery. Organized looting was part of Nazi state policy, and Göring played one of the leading roles in this process. Closely associated with Hitler, who considered himself an art connoisseur and planned to create a gigantic Führer museum in Linz, Göring was no less ambitious than his leader. He dreamed of creating his own North German gallery and turned his luxurious Hall estate into a veritable private museum where he exhibited his looted treasures. Thus, the figure of Göring embodies a monstrous fusion of a passionate collector and a war criminal whose love of art was inseparable from the suffering and death of millions of people.
The origins of the collection and the first acquisitions. Hermann Göring began collecting art in the late 1920s, long before he became one of the most powerful men in the Third Reich. In 1928, after becoming a member of the Reichstag and receiving the income that came with it, Göring began acquiring works of art. At this early stage, his collection was formed mainly through purchases. However, as his power grew and the Nazi regime's influence expanded, the methods of adding to the collection underwent sinister changes. From relatively honest transactions, he gradually moved on to systematic extortion, confiscation, and outright looting. Numerous art dealers and agents who worked directly for the Reichsmarschall played a key role in this process. They scoured Europe for valuable works of art, which were then offered to Göring at a reduced price or even for free. Often, occupation stamps, which had minimal value for the owners of the works, were used as payment, or the money was paid much later, if at all. Moreover, Göring practiced a scheme in which some items were taken for temporary use or display with a promise to return them, but these promises were never fulfilled. He skillfully used his position and people's fear of authority to seize other people's treasures. Göring himself, despite the obvious nature of these transactions, cynically claimed that all his acquisitions were completely legal deals. In his view, whether it was confiscation from Jewish families or purchases from frightened owners for a pittance, it was all part of the legitimate process of redistributing cultural values in the new Europe. He saw no difference between collecting and looting, claiming, "All my collections were obtained by me legally." This statement only underscores the extent of cynicism and impunity with which Göring carried out his looting.
The scale and composition of the collection. Hermann Göring's collection was enormous in both size and artistic value. According to various estimates, it numbered about 4,263 items, making it the second largest in Nazi Germany after the collection intended for the Führer Museum in Linz. Among these works were true masterpieces of world art, covering various eras and styles, from the canvases of the old masters to the works of modernists. His collection included paintings by artists such as Albrecht Dürer, Lucas Cranach the Elder, Rembrandt, Peter Paul Rubens, Sandro Botticelli, as well as more contemporary artists, including Paul Cézanne, Henri Matisse, and Pablo Picasso. Göring used numerous residences to house his enormous collection, transforming them into lavish exhibition halls. His luxurious estate at Hall, located north of Berlin, became the main repository for his treasures. In addition, works of art adorned his castles in Berchtesgaden, Franconia, and Austria. It is important to note that about half of all these valuables were simply confiscated from the so-called enemies of the Reich, primarily from Jewish families and looted museums in the occupied territories. As the end of the war approached, fearing for the fate of his collection, Göring took steps to save it. In January 1945, he ordered a significant portion of the artworks to be transported from Karrenhall to Bavaria in the south. In 1943, some of the most valuable exhibits were hidden in a salt mine in Altaussee, Austria. This location was chosen for a reason. The constant temperature and humidity of the salt mines created ideal conditions for preserving fragile paintings and other works of art, protecting them from destruction.
Methods of looting and confiscation. With the Nazis' rise to power and the outbreak of World War II, the looting of artworks reached unprecedented proportions and became part of state policy. A special agency was created to systematically seize cultural treasures in the occupied territories, the operational headquarters of Reichsleiter Rosenberg, ERR. This organization conducted large-scale raids on museums, galleries, and private collections throughout Europe, especially in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Formally, the ERR was concerned with ensuring the preservation of cultural property, but in reality, it was the main instrument for its total confiscation. All looted treasures were subject to strict distribution, in which there was a clear hierarchy. The priority right of choice belonged to Adolf Hitler, who selected the best exhibits for his future Führermuseum in Linz. Second in line was Hermann Göring, who personally reviewed catalogs and visited the Musée des Arts Décoratifs in Paris, which had been converted into the ERR's central warehouse, to select works for his personal collection. Only after Hitler and Göring had satisfied their appetites were the remaining valuables transferred to the museums of the Third Reich and various NSDAP institutions. In addition to official channels of confiscation through the ERR, Göring actively used other methods. He resorted to blackmail, corruption, and outright coercion. Art dealers and gallery owners were pressured into selling masterpieces for next to nothing or exchanging them for less valuable works. Transactions were often documented to give them the appearance of legitimacy, even though payment was made in occupation stamps or at a price barely exceeding the cost of canvas and paint. Thus, under the guise of legal transactions, cynical and ruthless looting took place, depriving countless people of their cultural heritage.
The fate of the collection after the war. In the final months of the war, when the defeat of the Third Reich became apparent, Hermann Göring made desperate attempts to save his collection. He arranged for the artworks to be transported from his Karrenhall estate, which was soon blown up on his orders, to Berchtesgaden in southern Germany and to the salt mines of Altaussee in Austria. However, these efforts proved futile. Most of his collection was discovered and seized by American troops, in particular the 101st Airborne Division. A special unit of the Allied forces, the Monuments Men, played a key role in the rescue and return of the looted valuables. This group, consisting of art historians, museum curators, and archivists, was engaged in the search, cataloging, and restitution of works of art stolen by the Nazis throughout Europe. They worked meticulously at the central art collection point in Munich, where the recovered treasures were brought to establish their origin and return them to their rightful owners. Most of Göring's collection was returned to the countries and families from which it had been stolen. However, the fate of many of the works remains unknown. Some were destroyed in the chaos of the final days of the war, while others ended up in private collections and periodically reappear on the art market. The restitution process continues to this day, posing a complex legal and historical challenge. The heroic story of the rescue of valuables hidden in the Altaussee salt mine deserves special mention. In March 1945, Hitler issued the so-called Nero Decree, ordering the destruction of all infrastructure and cultural treasures on German territory so that they would not fall into enemy hands. The local Gauleiter placed aerial bombs in the mine to blow it up along with the masterpieces stored there. However, Austrian miners, risking their own lives, secretly removed the explosives and blocked the entrances to the tunnels, staging a collapse. Thanks to their courage, priceless works of art, including many from Göring's collection, were saved from imminent destruction.
Scandals and fakes in the collection. Despite the grand scale and artistic value of the collection, the history of Göring's collection was not without scandals and curious episodes that undermined his reputation as an art connoisseur. The most notorious of these was the story of the acquisition of a fake painting attributed to Jan Vermeer. Eager to add a masterpiece by the Dutch master to his collection, Göring exchanged the painting Christ and the Prostitute with a Dutch art dealer, giving him 137 other stolen works of art in return. He considered this painting to be the jewel of his collection. Imagine his disappointment when, after the war, it turned out that the author of the painting was not Vermeer, but the talented forger Hans van Meegeren. When van Meegeren was arrested for collaboration and selling national treasures to the enemy, he confessed to the forgery to save his life. This news, they say, deeply shocked Göring, who was already on trial in Nuremberg. The realization that he, who considered himself a great connoisseur, had been so cleverly duped was a severe blow to his pride. This episode vividly illustrates the duality of the Reich Marshal's character. On the one hand, he tried his best to create the image of an aristocrat with refined taste, a connoisseur and patron of the arts. His residences were supposed to resemble the palaces of European monarchs, and his collection was supposed to rival the best museums in the world. On the other hand, he was always a pragmatic and greedy businessman. He haggled fiercely, unwilling to pay full price for works of art, used his position to pressure sellers, and preferred looting to honest purchases. The collapse of the Nazi regime also meant the collapse of his collection, which was not just a collection of valuables for him, but a symbol of power, might, and personal triumph. In the last months of his life, deprived of his treasures, power, and even his military uniform, he faced complete disappointment. The greatness that he so diligently built on the bones and sufferings of others turned out to be an illusion, and his precious collection was nothing more than a catalogue of his crimes. The gloomy walls of Nuremberg prison became the final refuge for a man whose ambitions as a collector were as boundless and monstrous as his political deeds.
Significance and legacy of the collection. Hermann Göring's collection left a deep and tragic mark on the cultural history of the 20th century. It is not just a collection of works of art, but one of the most extensive and vivid testimonies to the systematic looting carried out by the Nazi regime throughout Europe. It has become a symbol of how a passion for art can be perverted and put at the service of a criminal ideology, transforming itself from a creative force into an instrument for the destruction of the cultural heritage of entire peoples. Today, the legacy of this collection lives on in the ongoing work to restore historical justice. The German Historical Museum in Berlin plays a key role in this process, having published an online catalog and database of works from the Göring collection. This database has become an invaluable tool for researchers, art historians, and, most importantly, for the descendants of Holocaust victims who are still trying to find and recover works of art taken from their families. The publication of this information helps to trace the origins of the works, identify them at auctions and in private collections, and initiate restitution processes. Experts agree that Göring's collection is not just a list of stolen valuables, but an important historical lesson. It demonstrates how closely the aesthetic ambitions of Nazi leaders were intertwined with their racial ideology and genocide. Studying the methods used to build this collection sheds light on the mechanisms of Nazi terror and shows that the plundering of cultural treasures was not a side effect of the war, but a deliberate and carefully planned part of it. Thus, the history of this collection serves as a lasting reminder of the crimes of Nazism and the fragility of cultural heritage in the face of totalitarian power.